Mayor's office. She'll speak to us a little bit about the broader housing policy issues. David Swartz, our consultant, is here to talk about the recommendations from the draft report that was posted at the end of last week. And then I'm going to run through the pieces of legislation that we all have to talk about, and primarily the one that's in front of the council now, Bill 2016-133. So I'll turn it over to Adrian and we'll get started. Hopefully, after we go through the information, we'll have a robust discussion among the council members and the commissioners from both commissions.
Oh, it's not yours.
So good evening to all of you. Thank you so much to the Planning Department staff for convening this meeting with all the different commissions, with the Planning Commission, the Barnes Commission, and the Ad Hoc Committee. My name is Adrian Harris, and I'm the Mayor's Senior Advisor for Affordable Housing in the Office of Economic Opportunity and Empowerment. Our focus has really been in this office to work on labor and workforce development, affordable housing, as well as financial empowerment. So that's what our office does. But tonight we're talking about affordable housing, and I think all of us here are very much dedicated to increasing housing options in Nashville. And I just kind of want to talk about what we've been working on in the past 6 months. It's really been looking at the framework of Nashville Next. How do we build, fund, preserve, and retain affordable housing here? You've heard me probably talk about Metro Properties. The Barnes Commission, some of the representatives are here tonight, approved 13 properties to be donated to nonprofit organizations here. And so 13 of those properties have been awarded and will go to council hopefully next month for approval to donate those properties over. So that's 13 rental as well as homeownership opportunities. We've also been working on sustainability efforts. I mean, the one thing we want to make sure of is, as we're talking about affordable housing, that we make sure that we have the deed restrictions in place to keep them affordable for longer. With the 13 properties, there will be a 20-year affordability restriction. And so this is the first time that Metro has really had deed restrictions related to affordable housing. So this has taken some time, but we feel like this is a time well spent on making sure we have these properties affordable for longer. We've also been working on the neighborhood stabilization piece. We're working on a grant that was just submitted last week related to rehab and repair. And so we hope that we are able to win that grant that could assist us with expanding an existing rehab and repair program. The promotion of the tax relief and tax freeze program will be critical as we go through the whole property tax appraisal piece. And so we're working with the Mayor's Office of Neighborhood and Community Engagement to promote those programs. Additionally, we've been meeting with over 75 stakeholders in the community that's related to affordable housing. This includes nonprofit housing developers, this includes private developers, as well as the community overall. We've met with several of the advocate community as well, and we've just been having meetings just to kind of hear and listen. Additionally, we staff the Barnes Fund for Affordable Housing, the Metro Affordable Housing Trust Fund Commission, a lot of words. And since 2013, it was created in 2013, and there's been about $5 million that have been allocated to nonprofits in the area for nearly or over 100 units. Our funding expectations going forward is that $5 million is dedicated with the sale of the old convention center. We have $1 million that's dedicated through the Metro General Fund. So just this year alone, there's an expectation of about $5 million in the Housing Trust Fund, which is incredible, being that we've had $5 million over 2 years and expecting this amount in this 1 year. So we've really been working with, and the Trust Fund Commission members will let you know that we've been talking about the expansion of the structure. We've been talking about expanded uses as well with the Barnes Housing Trust Fund. And these are just the photos at the bottom are really some of the developments that came out of the 2014 awards. The one on the left side is a 4-bedroom rental unit. And there are 4 of those on that one street. So these are the types of projects that we're thinking about. It expands above traditional housing needs. There's a huge need for large families, And so this one on the left is one that was dedicated for large family development. The one in the middle was done by Woodbine Community Organization, which I don't know if many of you know, there was, the Woodbine Community Organization is one of the largest affordable housing development agencies here in Nashville. And recently, Kathy Dodd, who was the executive director, passed away last week. So we've lost a huge treasure in the affordable housing world, but that organization still moves on. And she was primarily working on elderly and senior housing, so that's what's in the middle is kind of the co-housing. And then right at the corner of 26th and Clarksville is a development done that's happening as we speak through Urban Housing Solutions for rental housing opportunities, and there will be about 23 units at that corner. So these are the types of projects that the Barnes Fund actually approves. So going forward, the next 6 months, I think the great thing about the time that we have right now is the fact that we have a commitment from the mayor. The mayor has, even on the campaign trail, talked about significant increases in housing development resources. That could mean more properties. That could mean increasing the funding for the Barnes Housing Trust Fund. The whole point is, as we're talking about housing policy, it's multifaceted, it's complex, it has to be coordinated. And I think I've kind of touched on the Housing Trust Fund piece, I've touched on the property disposal process, but we're also talking about private-public partnerships. We know that this is not just a government answer to affordable housing, that it's going to require that we work with the nonprofit development community as well as the private development community. We know that part of this is going to be on messaging. We want to make sure that communities know that it's okay to have different housing options in their communities. Additionally, we're working with MDHA and we're understanding RAD, the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program, which is starting in Casey. And you've probably heard some words about that. And then we're also, again, hoping to expand the tax relief and tax freeze programs. Preservation is key, so as we continue on talking about more funding and expanding the uses of the Barnes Housing Trust Fund, we will have to think about rehab and repair programs. But we're not here to talk about this full affordable housing policy, although I think that is what we need to talk about and we need to have more discussions about. The inclusionary zoning legislation is why we're here tonight, and I think this is a critical tool for this overall multifaceted approach to affordable housing. Just know that the mayor is very much fully committed to this issue and will be working on some type of announcement coming soon related to an increase in funding and properties. And so we hope that that will come soon. We're in the middle of budget hearings now. So hopefully we can hear more from the mayor on that. But tonight, again, we're going to talk about this really complex tool, so I hope we're all ready for the technical kind of discussion of the zoning modifications. And so I'm going to turn it over to David Schwartz.
Thanks, Adrian. Let me pull up my presentation. So it can't be reiterated enough that this is one tool and one piece among many tools and pieces that are a part of our recommendations to Doug and Carrie in addressing the housing, the affordable housing needs that are very, very multifaceted. I think so that as some people have characterized, that if you imagine a grid of a lot of different issues, inclusionary zoning touches on perhaps just one of those squares in that grid. And in a similar way, this short presentation covers one square in a grid of recommendations that we have made to Doug and Carrie, including primarily a dedicated funding source which could address lots of those squares in that grid. But tonight, I would like to give you an overview of the recommendations that we made on the inclusionary zoning ordinance to the city. Firstly, the policy should be countywide. The issues are really countywide. And it should apply to both for-sale projects and rental projects. Now, being that this is an incentive-based zoning ordinance or a voluntary inclusionary zoning ordinance, it is such because of the state rent control prohibition, which means that a mandatory policy cannot be adopted under current state law that would require new rental projects to comply with a mandatory set-aside. But under voluntary compliance structure, a development could participate in setting aside units as affordable. The second basic part of the recommendation is that the ordinance, the policy would apply under two conditions. They don't have to be, they're not additive conditions, but either or. Under one condition, that if a project applies for additional entitlements, such as additional density beyond what is by right, then the incentive-based zoning ordinance would apply. Secondly, or alternatively, if a project applies to receive public financing, except those projects which are already affordable or workforce housing developments, then the incentive-based zoning ordinance would apply as well. Two basic, if not three, options would be available, which are common among inclusionary zoning ordinances. The first is that a project comply with the policy by building affordable units on site in the development and be eligible to receive then the incentives, which include, obviously, a density bonus, which is a part of the trigger mechanism, is in itself an incentive. It has economic value. Alternatively to building the units on site, a development could make an in lieu contribution to a housing trust fund, such as the Barnes Housing Trust Fund. Another option that has been discussed and is really on the table because it's a part of most of these structures is some sort of alternative satisfaction option where instead of building on site or making an in lieu contribution, a project could build units elsewhere. The elsewhere is a part of the questions that need to be raised, and how far that elsewhere is also a big talking point. The major part of this inclusionary zoning structure is the set aside. Some cities around the country, there are, I think by recent counts, there are some 500 cities around the country, municipalities of various sizes that have some sort of inclusionary zoning ordinance, whether it's mandatory or voluntary. I would say some, if not most, of those have a uniform set-aside requirement, no matter what the project is, no matter what the scale of the project or whatever the type of the project is, such as if you build a project of this scale or that scale, you provide 10% or 15%, which are the most common set-aside amounts of your project as affordable. Other cities, there are probably a couple handfuls and perhaps a growing number of cities as they are looking at their ordinances, realizing there needs to be a little bit more sensitivity to the economics of different project scales. So for some cities, and as we are recommending to the city of Nashville, is that there be some sensitivity that reflect the scale of the project, and that is a reflection of the economics of that construction type. So our basic structure, and I should actually, before I get there, the other basic element which is standard among these types of ordinances is that there is a single requirement for affordability. That is, if it's a rental project, or if it's a rental ordinance, in those few cases where an inclusionary zoning ordinance affects rental development, that requirement is typically at 60% 20% of the area median income. For sale inclusionary zoning ordinance structures, that affordability requirement typically falls at 80% of the area median income. The recommended structure here is based on the feasibility modeling that we did during the process. And that is to categorize the set-asides according to the construction type. So you see single-family, two-family, multifamily uses less than 3 stories in one level. The second tier is multifamily uses 3 to 6 stories, and the higher of the construction types is multifamily uses greater than 7 stories. This roughly coincides with the construction types. So typical wood frame construction for the lower density single family and lower density multifamily uses, wood frame and or concrete podium plus wood frame construction for the multifamily uses 3 to 6, and then high-rise construction, which is a different type of construction, steel or concrete, there are different economics that accompany those projects. So the sensitivity, if you see the structure generally if you just look at the first column on the left side, you see 20, 15, and 10%. You see a tiering down of the set-aside requirement for those, and that is a direct reflection of the economics of those projects. Now, moving across within that first box there, on the rental side, there is a column for 60% AMI, a set-aside column for 80%, and a column for a set-aside at 100% AMI. Now, those do have numbers except for the single-family, two-family, and less than 3 stories, so that that AMI level is an option for development within the UZO and along corridors. I think it's corridors excluding expressways, freeways, and on-ramps, which is kind of an obvious one. But the set-asides as recommended are at, I would say, they have been maximized according to the development feasibility model. So they reflect the point at which it is feasible by comparison to by right development feasibility to set aside these portions of of a rental development as affordable at those AMI levels without lowering the return on cost, the metric used for rental developments, beyond the return on cost for a project under base entitlement. Backing up a little bit here, the 2 major affordability recommendations for this are that a rental project provide affordability for a minimum of 15 years, and that a for sale project provide affordability for a minimum of 30 years. That would be a deed restricted project. Carrie will note this in a slide that she has, but on the right side you see a consistent 10 and 15% for the 80 and the 100% AMI. The economics of inclusionary zoning on for sale developments do not work as well, if nearly at all, for sale projects as they do rental projects. So this is based on essentially best practice, essentially what others are doing with their inclusionary zoning ordinances on for sale projects. You would have a baseline requirement for a set aside at 80% AMI, and for high cost areas or for high cost structures, for example, in the CBD or the Gulch or other areas that are hot markets, you would offer an option to include a slightly higher percentage of units at a higher percent AMI. In fact, one of the bigger pieces of the recommendation is the incentive. Aside from the density, which has economic value in both for sale and rental projects, there is a limit to the incentives that are really available or that can be granted to a for sale project. There's a slide I have later on that I can show. I'm sure this question is going to come up, but essentially the difference between to fully incentivize a for sale project, you would have to fill the gap or finance the gap between what you're requiring a developer to provide in terms of an affordability level and what the market rate price is. To really have a net neutral or a neutral impact on the project and for it to remain as feasible as a by right development, that per unit incentive would have to be the actual difference between the market rate and the affordable unit. That doesn't exist anywhere in the country in terms of best practices. Nobody has that kind of money, and even if they did, I'm not so sure that would be really the best use of public funds to fund such a wide gap on a per unit basis. So the best that can be done is something that at least is motivating, and there are some communities that have. We talked about this in one of the meetings either in November and December, where some of the incentives can be fee waivers. They can be deferred fees or simply waived fees. But in this case, a cash subsidy is effectively what that's trying to accomplish. So for projects in the UZO and along corridors, we recommend a per unit incentive of $20,000. Outside of the UZO would be an incentive of about $10,000. To put that into perspective, the fees for developing a project can often be anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000 themselves, if not a lot more, depending on the location, depending on the project itself. Per unit, correct. On the rental side, this is where we really feel that the strongest incentives exist. By other names around the country, there are a couple cities that have this in practice, and I mentioned this in previous meetings. The city of Portland uses this. In fact, Chattanooga also uses this. Memphis uses this to a certain extent. Jersey City has recently adopted a program like this. Essentially, when you're looking at the feasibility of a rental project, you're looking at the net operating income and you're looking at the project cost. So you're looking at a financial performance metric of return on cost. Property taxes can often be a considerable or a substantial portion of the per unit operating cost or expenses for a project. And in Nashville, property taxes are quite considerable. In research that we did, low land value areas in the county amount to about $1,700 per unit on property taxes, and in high land value areas, on average, per unit property taxes on rental projects can be anywhere from $3,800 to $6,200 a unit, which is an average of $4,700 per unit. That's a considerable amount of operational expense on a rental project, and so some cities have devised what they call payments in lieu of taxes pilot programs, which are essentially that if you're providing something in lieu of the payment of taxes, such as the provision of affordable housing, that has equal value to a community. And so a community like Jersey City, which calls theirs a pilot program, grants a certain amount or abates a certain amount of the property taxes according to the level of affordability and according to the term of affordability of those units. Portland simply calls it a property tax abatement. It's a different program, but it essentially accomplishes the same thing. Here, there is the grants authority. This grants authority essentially functions as a way to offset the property taxes associated with rental projects. So we calculated the effect of a grant that would be approximately equal to 50% of the property taxes for a project, and that turned out to be quite remarkably accretive to projects. In fact, it in most cases, if not all cases, it meant that the return on cost for a project complying with the affordable housing requirement and receiving that incentive was higher than the return on cost for a project just under base entitlement. So let me just kind of touch on this in lieu contribution option briefly, because it's a bit more complicated. This is essentially the option B or option C of the structure. Almost every community, there are a handful of communities that do not have an in lieu contribution option. I think that is not really a wise way to go in terms of structuring a policy, but most, if not nearly all, policies have an in lieu contribution option. There are a lot of different ways, a lot of different methods for calculating the in lieu contribution amount. The one that is most administrable and the easiest the easiest to administer and to calculate is the one that's based on the affordable sales price. So the basic recommendation is that the in lieu contribution be equal to 50% of the affordable sales price. Now, how that is calculated in a for sale project differs from how it's calculated in a rental project, and that also differs calculated within the UZO versus outside of the UZO. The basic motivation here is that it's the objective of the policy to make the on-site affordable housing option the desirable option. And so with that, it's intended that the in lieu contribution be less financially attractive or economically attractive to the decision maker, to a developer, than the option to pay an in lieu contribution. These have been structured according to that philosophy. This is just a bulleted list of a number of the general assumptions to the in lieu calculation. It would be the responsibility of the city or some entity to annually update what these in lieu contributions are. Not necessarily, not at all have to run the feasibility model again, but that the city would have to collect income information from HUD, look at what the prior 6-month moving average of the mortgage interest rates are on a 30-year fixed rate mortgage, make sure that the property tax calculations are correct, and look at average homeowner insurance costs. It would also be the prerogative of the city to ensure that the average affordable unit size is also properly calculated. There is a recommendation for an exemption. There are a variety of exemptions that could be made. The issue here is that Nashville's housing market is, as we went through a lot of the presentation material in the last few meetings, quite diverse, to put it lightly. There were a couple surprising statistics, such as the percent of housing inventory in the city that is affordable to somebody earning the median household income, and where average prices are extremely high, for example. So there are a lot of dynamics within the market that need to be accounted for. And so the exceptions or the exemptions that we're recommending are that essentially a project that's already providing what is otherwise affordable housing should not have to comply or be subject to the inclusionary zoning ordinance requirements. And so the recommended structure is that if a project is building units that it can demonstrate are priced within 5% of the average priced unit within that census tract or within that geography, then it shouldn't have to provide, it shouldn't have to fulfill the inclusionary zoning ordinance requirements. So there would be a couple demonstration requirements for that project, but it would essentially exempt a developer who is already providing essentially affordable housing from making that on-site build requirement. And I don't think we're taking questions just yet, but we're going to Carrie for her piece.
Thank you. I'm going to talk through the potentially five pieces of legislation that it would take to enact the recommendations that David's talked about. The first one is one of the bills that's already been provided to Metro Council. That's BL 2016-133, which establishes the inclusionary housing program with any rezoning, and that's really going to be the focus of our conversation today. We have another bill that's been proposed, 134, that's been deferred indefinitely by Metro Council, and we have extended David's contract to have a public input process with 134 so that we can get more input on how it addresses other bonuses and processes in the zoning code. There would need to be a piece of legislation establishing the grant program, dedicated funding included in the Metro budget, and potentially an ordinance to expand the role of the Housing Trust Fund Commission, if that's necessary under your existing enabling legislation. So we'll start with BL 2016-133. Then this bill incentivizes inclusionary housing with any additional development entitlements requested through the rezoning process. There are two exceptions, one that David just touched on. The first, though, is projects less than 5 residential units. So that includes developments that are under common ownership and controlled by the same person on adjoining property, and also development in already affordable areas. The idea being that Metro does not need to incentivize additional affordable or workforce housing units where the market rate is already equal to the countywide affordable rate, so that affordable and workforce housing is spread throughout the county. The proposed set-asides in the ordinance that was proposed are before you, and they are based on the housing grant of approximately equal to 50% of the increase in property taxes, or the $20,000 inside the UZO and on multimodal collectors, and $10,000 subsidy outside of the UZO. As I mentioned earlier, the grant portion would actually be in a separate piece of legislation that's here just for reference to tell you how we arrived at the set-aside numbers and the incentive that would offset those set-asides. Through the feasibility testing, or the sensitivity analysis, it has come to our attention that the for sale numbers at both 80% AMI and 100% AMI would need to be lowered to make a project closer to feasible. So here are the numbers in the existing 133, changing those to 10 and 15% for for sale projects. But it's important to note that this set aside on the for sale side is still not feasible when it's applied to the total floor area of the development, the floor area being simply the amount of square feet that's in the development. So if you have 10% that's applied to an entire building, like on a rental project, the development doesn't pencil anymore. And so one of the things that we're looking at prior to the final report is whether in the for sale scenario, the set-asides need to be, in order to be feasible, only applied to the additional square footage. And I'll run through some examples. So first up, a rental project. If in all of these scenarios, we're talking about a development that has a base entitlement of 100,000 square feet, and they're requesting an additional 50,000 square feet for a total of 150,000 square feet. So using the chart that David spoke about earlier, you would go, and the resulting building is greater than 7 stories. You would use that construction type, and the developer would have the option of looking at 60% AMI, 80% AMI, or 100% AMI within the UZO. And so if they chose 80%, the intersection of those two is at 20% of the total residential floor area, which means that 20% of the building, of the entire 150,000 square feet, or 30,000 square feet, would have to be provided as housing at 80% AMI. And we did that calculation on the number of square feet so that we could be flexible in the unit sizes that developers are providing, potentially hoping for some larger units that could house families. In the same example, but a for sale project, again, 100,000 square feet, 50,000 square feet of additional area, and the resulting building is over 7 stories. If they chose 80% AMI, that 15,000 square feet of that project would have to be provided at housing at 80% AMI. But this set aside still may not be feasible. So when doing the new testing, if it's applied only to the additional floor area, then 10% of only the 50,000 square feet, or only the portion that they're asking for increased density, would be provided as housing at 80% AMI. Again, there are 2 in lieu options. The first is in lieu construction within a half mile from the project site, and then an in lieu contribution option. As David mentioned, that the in lieu contribution option was intended to be approximately equal to the cost of construction of the affordable or workforce units that weren't being built. So using those same examples in the UZO, and for a rental project, the in lieu fee would be $3.5 million and $1.8 million for a for sale project if it was applied to the total square footage of the development. If it was applied only to the bonus area, that number would drop to $600,000. Outside of the UZO, the in lieu fee would be approximately $2.7 million for a rental project, $1.4 million for a for sale project, and $450,000 if it was applied only to the bonus floor area. There are a number of standards for construction and occupancy in the ordinance as proposed, so that a developer on the front end has to give Metro an affordable housing plan that includes their total number of units, whether they're using public resources or public property, the number of units that they're required to have, the income levels, and the proposed rents and sale prices, location, the sizes, the bedroom counts of the affordable units, and 9, the census tract market rate pricing is how we will enforce the exemption, whether they're in a census tract that's already affordable. And they'll have to give compliance reports to the Housing Trust Fund Commission. So some of the standards for construction are that they have to be the affordable units have to be 80% of the size of the market rate units, and that the bedroom counts have to be similar to what the project would otherwise propose. So if your project is 50% 3 bedrooms and 50% 2 bedrooms, the affordable housing requirement can't be satisfied with all 1-bedroom units. That the exteriors of the units have to resemble the exteriors of the market rate units, and that the owner has to ensure to Metro that the units will be occupied by eligible households and be maintained for 50 years for rental units and 30 years for for sale units. There's also a provision in BL 2016-133 that affects the DTC. This, though, is simply to remove the existing bonus language that's currently in the downtown code. It applies only to workforce housing in the bonus height program, and we'd be replacing that language with the language proposed for the rest of the code that would apply both to affordable and workforce housing units, so that all of the language regarding affordable and workforce housing incentives in the code is consistent. The second piece of legislation that's been presented to Metro Council is BL 2016-134. And this piece of legislation incentivizes inclusionary housing with any of the other development processes that result in bonus density or residential uses. Those include adaptive residential, special exceptions, and then reworking additional bonuses in the DTC that are not related to affordable and workforce housing. This bill has been indefinitely deferred by Metro Council to allow for additional community input, and as I mentioned, that's one of the things that we're going to ask David to work with us on over the next few months. The third and fourth pieces of legislation would be the grant program and any dedicated funding included in the Metro budget. Those decisions aren't under the purview of the planning department, and so we would still need an amount included in the budget for a dedicated funding source and a piece of legislation to develop the grant program. However, one of the things that David will continue working on over the next few weeks is looking at that formula for how the grant program is determined. Right now, the increase in the 50% of the increase in tax liability has some concerns from Metro Legal around the wording, and so we'll be working on a more precise formula that will target the gap between the affordable rental price and the market rate rental price. And that will do two things. It will ensure that the application of the inclusionary housing program is at a minimum a neutral impact to a residential development and hopefully a positive impact to a residential development. But it also ensure that Metro is allocating the appropriate amount of revenue, meaning we won't be giving away too much revenue at that constant 50% rate. There are some recommendations around the organizational recommendation and expanding the role of the Barnes Fund and needing a locally dedicated funding source to fund that, having the Barnes Fund or the Housing Trust Fund Commission be authorized to acquire land, develop land, potentially own and operate affordable housing, do maintenance assistance programs or down payment assistance programs, and to work with for-profit developers, as well as working with other partners to make loans with the funds. As I mentioned, we have extended our contract with EPS. I've talked about the first two on the list, but we also are asking for an analysis of for sale and rental housing needs and gaps by census tract and the calibration of the density bonuses that would be included in BL 2016-134. So the next steps on 133, to add the inclusionary housing requirement with increased development through the rezoning process, would be to have potentially, if the council desires, a substitute introduced in April at first reading and then proceed to public hearing in May. And then 134, which addresses all of the other zoning code issues, would have an expanded public input process. We'd look at what the right incentives to include, how they should be calibrated or equaled out, and whether there's any phasing needs. So I know that's a lot of information to cover in a short amount of time, but we hope to give you an overview of what we've proposed so far, what needs to be proposed in the future. We're open to taking questions and hopefully have a discussion among the council members and committee members.
I have five, but
Okay.
other people can jump in if they can turn this on. How often is the census tract income data compiled? Is that a yearly thing or every 10 years like the official census?
The census tract level data is these days compiled on it is available on an annual basis, but it is available lagged about a year and a half. So that when I first presented data back in October and November and December, the information that we used, the most recent data available was 2013. It was sometime right around the end of November or right before, actually no, it was the beginning of December that the census released some of its 2014 data for the city. I had not incorporated it yet into my presentation.
Gotcha. Okay. And then we talk about the Barnes Fund, $10 million, and then we talk about in lieu payments, and we talk about the grant money. And I'm just trying to figure out if those are the same pots of money or if they're different. Does the Barnes Fund function as the pot of money that will pay the incentives for the set-asides, or is that a different pot of money? And the Barnes Fund is used for all the other things that you mentioned before, or that Adrian mentioned before we actually got to the set-asides?
Well, I think the council will have to help with that question.
Okay.
And that the in lieu money could be put into the same pot and be used for that, but certainly additional funds could be.
Okay. So we got to decide that. Great.
To that point, that one of the things that our office has said since day one is, and Dave will back me on this, is that the best thing would be a dedicated funding source. And then the ebbs and flows of the market aren't going to dictate how much money you have necessarily to put towards workforce and affordable.
So one request I would make is, can David help suggest what potential dedicated funding sources are? Because I know that there are different sort of fees that you could look at, or a fund sales tax increase, which everyone would love, or whatever. And I think the council will have to initiate something, and we have a lot to learn on what those possibilities are. Where can we learn that from?
There's several sections in the report, right?
Yeah, there are a couple sections in the report. In Chapter 3 on the policy options that talk about the different funding sources, such as a dedicated sales tax or a dedicated property tax. And I noted in there that I don't think that a dedicated sales tax would be appropriate, since Nashville in 2014 was tied for the third highest sales tax in the country. So wouldn't really recommend that route, but
you have a good list of best practices around the country that we could look at.
That's correct.
Have we gotten some from Metro? Because I don't think there's any provision in the Metro Charter to use a dedicated property tax.
You're precisely right. Actually, there is one, but it's just for schools.
Right.
That you would have to amend the charter to do that. If you want to create a dedicated funding source that you didn't have to worry about year after year, that's correct.
So we just need to get on.
Well, and you don't, speaking out of turn, but for sales tax, I think most people could apply. I'm trying to be policy neutral on this. It hurts poor people as much instead of progressive tax.
Yeah.
Before you finish the Barnes Fund thing, these are just a couple of the pie slices we've been talking about for the Barnes Fund. There's still the rebuilding together type, keeping people in their home type thing, and land acquisition.
Adrian went over, right?
Yeah,
Right,
and that kind of goes back to, if there's a dedicated funding source and if there's an influx of funding in the Barnes Fund, then maybe there could be different uses that could be a part of that Barnes Fund. I mean, right now, the only thing that's been done is new construction, acquisition, new construction, and acquisition rehab, but there could be a portion of that funding that could be used for expansion of rehab or reaffirmation.
And does this study sort of, since it focuses largely on this zoning legislation that we've talked about, does it take into account in that $10 million those uses as well, or is that $10 million what is needed strictly for these incentives?
No, the $10 million, that kind of a magnitude of an annual dedicated funding source is a number that is, I think, at least a minimum that the city should shoot for in terms of making a substantial progress toward achieving affordable housing production goals. When you think about how much it costs to to finance gaps or subsidize projects such as low-income housing tax credit projects. 4% projects have wider financing gaps than 9% projects do. 9% projects are far more limited in number, but still when you consider average municipal contributions, non-tax credit equity contributions to those projects, they're anywhere from $25,000 a unit to up to, I know communities that spend $100,000 a unit on 4% projects. And so $10 million would only get you 100 of those $100,000 per unit incentives. So it has to be a substantial amount to go far. I mean, it's $25,000 a unit, then you get 400 units a year with $10 million. And that's with no administrative costs on the $10 million.
And when you talk about the 4% and the 9% and the low-income housing tax credit projects, those are totally separate from the set-asides that we're talking about. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Different allocation. Okay, great. So when we talk about, now back to this specific legislation, is this addressing workforce housing or sort of by the 60, 80, and sometimes 100 that we're talking about? Is that
That's really workforce housing.
that would be considered workforce? So we're hitting workforce and,
Yes.
and quote affordable with that as well. Okay, I think I'm to my last question. Nope, that was it. Those are all mine.
So I want to talk a little bit about the Florida area ratios and the numbers that are being presented by you versus the numbers that were in the original draft. It seems to me that looking at those percentages, that it would be fair to say within the 80 and 100% AMI that we would be probably more greatly incentivizing rental versus for sale. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. That concerns me a little bit because of two things, and one is, well, they're both political. The first thing is the way that we have to be tasked as a council is we have to say that this is addressing a direct need in the city. And the problem that I'm finding when I go to talk about affordable housing is the first thing that we all probably get, which is, well, what is affordable housing? And the percentage of AMI for people that we're talking about. The first questions that came to me when we distributed the properties from the trust fund was, are these for sale or are these for rent? And people make a very clear distinction in their mind about the differences between for sale and for rent. That's ingrained over generations about what we expect from, quite frankly, the American dream. And so if we're going to be talking about we're incentivizing rental over for sale, my fear is we're creating this permanent underclass to where we talk about affordability almost strictly in terms of rental. And if we are even lowering the Florida area ratio that we are looking at when it comes to for sale, just at 80 and 100%, I don't see, especially given the conversations I've had where in my district people are willing to do 20% at 20 units and above, I don't see why we are moving so far. It seems like we're moving the pendulum so far the other way. Whereas before we were concerned about rental and how we couldn't do inclusionary zoning, mandatory inclusionary zoning with rental. But now we're so far the other way about incentivizing rental that somehow we leave out the fact that if we don't create at least a decent base for sale units, then we're not accomplishing what I think the public expects us to do.
Just to respond a little bit to that, I would characterize it more along the lines of not that this recommendation is seeking to incentivize rental more. It's that you can't incentivize for sale development enough. The problem is that because you're looking at this from a feasibility perspective, there is no incentive that you can possibly give to, actually there is incentive that you can possibly give to for sale developments, but there isn't enough resource for that. And so flip to that.
But what do you mean by that? When you say resource, you're just saying there's just not enough money that
the city doesn't have enough money, and I wouldn't recommend that the city put up that kind of money for this. I mean, so there's
It's the return on your investment. I mean, depending on how much money we're willing to allocate for this, I mean, you can do it, but understand that the numbers that you're going to introduce into the market are so much lower than the number of units that you can provide housing for. through rental. And I understand what, I completely understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
It's just, we can break it down so you can say, well, this is, for $10 million, what we're going to be able to produce, or
Now, so just at this point, I mean, maybe it's clear if you look at the screens. I don't know. The top two rows here show what the per unit incentive on a for sale development would actually have to be in order to motivate a developer to do the project. They are essentially the difference between. Sorry.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
They're essentially the difference between the affordable unit and the market rate unit. But but because the objective of the analysis was to do a feasibility model on the inclusionary zoning ordinance, I'm looking at the feasibility, and these are the results that show you would have to incentivize it to this extent, or you're going to risk stunting growth at all. So the alternative is, and this is what some communities experience, is that by adopting one of these ordinances and placing a mandate on development, you actually deter development from occurring in the first place. So you lower the quantity of housing that's produced, which then exacerbates the affordability problem that you were seeking to solve in the first place. So it's a bit of a complicated equation to try to work out here, but we're not backing off of the recommendation to try to structure this act properly. It simply is stating that based on the feasibility model, it's far more feasible to incentivize rental development, rental affordability, than it is to try to incentivize a mandate for a for sale project. So, Councilman Mendez.
Just if I can follow up on what Colby asked about and then ask a couple questions of my own. I think part of the issue, and you're touching on it, is Colby's got the experience in his district on the ground that for individual projects, there are developers that are interested in sticking a higher percentage of this for sale affordable units. And I know Anthony's done the same thing on a individual project by project basis in his district. And so I think part of the question is just trying to challenge or understand the difference between the ad hoc on the ground experience of some individual developers being willing to do that in their districts versus the macro, it's not feasible. Do you have any thoughts about why they might be running into that in their respective districts?
I have a thought.
Yeah.
I think at least some of those projects, the feasibility model incorporated a 20% increase in density as sort of as one of the inputs. And the projects that you're referencing are getting a much higher increased density than 20%. I think specifically in the one in your district.
70%, 10 to 17. And I was going to say too, I saw something about the square footage as being the same. We were doing smaller units, which has to be considered density bonus models with the smaller units for more starter homes in this for sale thing. If we could do something like that though, maybe that's something we can package up.
Yeah, when I look at I'm going from 4 to 80. And so there's no model.
Right.
The model doesn't account for that. And so I guess it's on top of Councilman Davis's point.
Yeah, right.
How do we include those?
Well, that's a really good point because I
expand the model.
Yeah, I'm not going to say that the model that we use to estimate these results can account for every eventuality or every possible scenario. That's why we have asked and are still asking anybody with development experience who wants to run their own numbers with these kind of inputs to test it, because there are going to be cases that defy the sort of logic of a macro model like this with generalized assumptions that's trying to encapsulate and characterize the experience, if you will, of the development community with
with this policy in place, there may be some cases like this where going from such a low number to a high number, it is entirely feasible. I would anticipate it would be entirely feasible for somebody to say, I will build 25% of those units for sale as affordable. And the model that you've got is showing that that should be feasible. But because of those unique circumstances, it's entirely possible that there should be a provision to allow for that.
Well, we can look into that.
I mean, because everything I'm doing, they're not asking a 20% bonus. They're asking density increase. They're often doubling and tripling. That. Would it be possible to rerun the model based on that? We'll look at that.
That's fine. I just don't want to disincentivize the greatest opportunities that we have for affordability. Because they're outliers within this model.
Yeah, run numbers on higher percentages and then run numbers on percentages of square footage of the affordable units, compared to the other units in the development. Like, are they 50% of the size, or those other units 75%?
We can look at that. Of course, by that I mean David can look at that.
Excel sheets.
Can I ask my question? Yeah. That was all Colby's question. So one of the things I want to make sure I understand is when you're figuring out where the break point is, where something is as feasible, which I think by as feasible you mean as profitable for the developer, you're using the standard is as profitable as the base entitlement.
Base entitlement.
And so, we're gonna hear from the development community because we've been hearing it, and I think there's something to it. So I want to make sure to ask about it. The argument is that, sure, I understand what base entitlement is, but market prices reflect base entitlement plus what the market assumes you can get under current policy and practices. And furthermore, there's people who have bought property 1 year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago with prices that sort of build in the expectation about what you could get above base entitlement. And so I'm hearing those people in the back of my head saying, man, if you want to use the standard as being how feasible it is compared to base entitlement, you're still leaving me hanging and making less than what sort of my imputed value is after I've paid for the land based on what I expect I'll get based on current custom and practice. What's the response to that?
Let me say that one of the things, we've had several developers share their performance with us and what their return rate is on different types of development, right? Mm-hmm. And did you notice whether those percentage on returns were equal to or close to the assumptions regarding base entitlement, the returns on base entitlement developments? Did you get a chance to compare those?
Well, actually, the information that was shared was generally not the returns. It was the project. It would have been the project development costs. Okay. So we, as much as we often work with the development community in this sort of a situation, there's a little bit of less of an interest in sharing all of the numbers.
I'm pretty sure they're not going to tell you their preferred rate.
The preferred rates of return change depending on who the investors and the equity is, and the product and the amount of risk, because the amount of risk has a considerable amount of impact.
Well,
and the external capital markets.
Let me ask it this way. Even anecdotally, I mean, do you feel like there's something to that argument, or do you feel like there's not something to it?
Well, let me add on to his question. What is the anticipated trigger date? So if you bought land 2 years ago and you're going through the process of trying to get additional entitlements, design, construction plans, get financing, I didn't see any mention of the anticipated trigger date. Is it truly going to be July 1st when the council passes this, or is there going to be some?
Well, that's up to the council. The council would set the trigger date within the legislation, and if they would set it within the legislation as far as what the trigger date is. But I think they have been willing to share what their their anticipated return rate is on different developments. And if it's 7 stories or greater, that's 6.5, somewhere along those, and it changes depending on the product. Obviously, single family being the highest.
Well, there are some industry standard metrics for return on cost depending on the market. I've worked with some developers in the past who were shooting for a 6% return on cost or something slightly lower. That was in a different market cycle. And on an unleveraged rate of return, internal rate of return on projects, the base is usually 12% on that type of a project. It changes and it fluctuates depending on the amount of risk there is in the project. But maybe more specifically, if I am licensed to answer the question about how far in advance a policy like this gets implemented and how that compares to the time frame by which you've described this scenario, I would say that most policies get established at some point in the future. It's probably about 12 months out from the announcement itself, and that is, or it is some period of time that is at least equal to, if not slightly greater than, the development review process time, such as submission of conceptual plan or first review or whatever the actual process, the first piece of the process is. From that point in time to receiving final approval is typically the standard window of kind of notice for this, and this is an issue that every community has to deal with when making land use development policy decisions. Is when it's going to take effect and what type of an impact it's likely to have. This is likely to have this kind of a policy, although I would actually say that this type of policy is intended not to be as disruptive as a blanket mandatory policy would be, but essentially any of those types of policies are impacting land values and the expectation of land value. And so that is being capitalized into what a developer, what a landowner is being willing to pay or want to sell a piece of land for. So if the expectation of return is based on looking at what revenues are possible 2 and 3 years out, there is going to be a market adjustment period.
I will say that I think Bill 134 probably has a bigger chance of being disruptive to the market than probably even 133 does. Well, that depends on the percentages attached to 133. But 134 deals with a lot of the incentives that are already in our zoning code today, that a lot of property, as you were just saying, a lot of property has been bought and sold based on the assumptions that the zoning code isn't going to change. So as we move forward, one of the reasons that I think there's a lot of wisdom in the Commission's suggestion that we divide that bill to deal with those zoning code changes at a more extended time where you can have a public conversation as opposed to 133 is because you can figure out a way to make those changes less disruptive to the
one more, and then I'll let it go. So setting aside the conversation we had about where there's such an increase, I'm talking about for sale units, setting aside what we were talking about a few minutes ago with Colby's question, based on the incentive or at $20,000 a unit, you all would expect everybody to do the in lieu of payment?
At 20,000?
Yeah, 20 and 10. Inside and out?
Yeah, I don't see. Yeah, absolutely.
Everybody would do the in lieu of payment?
Yes. I would anticipate everyone would choose. When you look at these numbers,
Right. I mean, we might as well put it at 0 because nobody's,
I agree. I don't think it'll make much of an impact.
Without a much larger density, but that was the setting aside. for it.
right,
Yeah,
except
much
for
larger
that
density.
piece.
Yeah.
Right. All right, thank you.
David, what happens in economic times when development comes to a screeching halt for a lot of macro reasons? What have you seen in other cities with trying to incent development through these programs when the market just won't allow for it?
Let me make sure I understand the question right. So what happens in a market when a policy like this might be adopted?
No, but if you've got a time frame like you had in 2007 through 2009.
Right.
Where you've got the lack of capital coming externally.
And you have a program like this in place?
Correct.
It is you might have the greatest incentives available at looking at a time like 2007 through 2009, or even actually many of the years that follow that. I can tell you. I mean, I probably once said we work with public and private sector clients, and during that time, we didn't work with any private developers because there weren't any private developers doing any work for about 4 years.
I think that's
and it doesn't matter how strong the incentives are. If there is no access to capital, which there wasn't, then there's nobody's willing to take the risk, and nobody's willing to extend equity for a project.
I think for the council's benefit, the challenge you all have is to try to make this policy change effective enough to allow for it to work in those times, because you're taking some type of revenue from some dedicated source, and the city is saying, we're going to go ahead and in those economic crisis times, we're going to step in and do this with those funds.
It just goes back to the dedicated funding source again. And if you had that dedicated funding source in a downswing, actually what you're going to be able to do is build your stock of affordable housing at a greater rate during that time.
Anecdotally, there was one project, and I may be digressing with this, but it's just to illustrate the point, though, and to kind of hit that point home. There was one developer that I was working with during that time, and in the city of Denver, and it was a 12-story rental project, and had a program like this been in place. I guarantee that developer would have taken advantage of this housing grant structure without any question. Not only would that have been true, but it was true that because nobody else was building, and because that meant contractors were basically out of jobs, and they were desperate to do work. The cost of construction on that project was easily 30% less than it had been the year before, which meant that in those kind of times, with that tool and with that reality, you could get units built.
Yeah, I think for y'all's benefit, that's the opportunity, is to accelerate during those tough times, because construction pricing is down, land pricing is down, contractors are desperate for work, and if the city thinks holistically enough, then we can really accelerate during the down times.
Stuart, did you have a question?
2007 to 2009 were, the glory days of the commission. We used to get out in 20 minutes, but other than that.
There are a couple of them 5 minutes.
I think you've raised an interesting point, Councilman Sledge, because I know they're very creative for sale developers, and it sounds like there'd be some potential way within the confines or as an exception in some way to account for the successes that they've had. But I also, maybe it's overly simplistic, but, my fear is that this will become a middle-class program only, which is not exactly the same as workforce housing, but I'm not interested in proposing any program or having the city adopt anything that really neglects the truly poor. And I don't think the council will be either. So it's I've always assumed that most of the housing for non-workforce but desperately needed housing for lower income, that would have to be largely rental. You don't
Sure, no, I don't disagree at all. I think it gets back again to the dedicated funding. I mean,
Because this doesn't.
Yeah, because I would say with the Barnes Housing Trust Fund, I mean,
Yes.
the objective is 80% or below.
Okay.
And so I think the whole purpose of the Housing Trust Fund was kind of to look at the very low,
Okay,
extremely
good.
low, and even that 80%.
The other comment is, the dedicated funding source is the trickiest one, of course. We really are, as the legislature likes to tell us, we really are a creature of the state legislature. We are by the state constitution. It actually is true. They control us. And they have given us limited ways of raising money. And the charter has limited that further. So it is a tricky business to come up with a dedicated funding source. We can't have a property tax dedicated, apparently, without a charter amendment. We can't have a sales tax, except I think we have 1/4 of 1 cent left in terms of what the state maximum is, which anybody who's for social justice is not for that, because it's already too high, and has been rejected once at the polls, as I recall.
Well,
So I guess I'm just wondering, I guess I'm just saying, yes, that's a crucial issue, and it sounds like we're not.
they were kind enough to
brainstorming.
give us the ability to do grants recently.
They what?
They were kind enough to give us the ability to do these grants.
This session.
And so it's about dedicating those funds. And the council has the authority to dedicate part of our operating funds towards that. I mean, there's that opportunity, but the only thing, and I think everybody in this room understands that the danger there is that during hard times, it's going to be one of the probably first things on the chopping block.
But to Stuart's point, if the issue is critical enough for Nashville as a city, how difficult would a charter amendment be for you all? And that's y'all's.
Well, we're not voting yet, but it'd certainly be a lot easier to sell than a sales tax increase, I hope. But that's just me. That is, I think, worth the real discussion.
So I have a question. So I'm in the southeast. The reason I started talking about this is because we keep getting all the displaced people are moving to the southeast. We're happy to have them, but it's destabilizing, it's creating concentration of poverty. We don't have the infrastructure to help them be successful. So I still don't see anything in the conversation about dealing with gentrification. So I wanted to ask you to put something in the legislation that will kick in a moratorium or a freezing on demolition based on gentrification not being dealt with. So can we create some kind of a trigger situation there where if we end up failing to deal with gentrification, then we'll just stop demolishing around Nashville, or we just create a moratorium?
What do you imagine that looks like?
I don't know, but it doesn't solve my problem. I mean, I'm being selfish, and I'm at the receiving end. We are at the receiving end, and I just don't see any conversation to address the concern that brought me to this table to begin with.
Doug, if I may? Okay.
I mean, this is, I was glad to hear my grid reference get some traction. But I mean, to me, Councilman, this is the key thing of the inclusionary zoning, which is most of the conversation today, is never in a million years going to address that, ever. And so there's nothing I don't think that we can put in this legislation that will address that concern. I think the thing we have to do as a council is make sure that, assuming the mayor's office proposes some dedicated funding, that there's some other 2 or 3 or 4 programs that get stood up at the same time rather than tackling one issue and then saying, oh, gee, 2017 will take care of, saving houses that ought to be affordable. Dealing with expanding freeze on property taxes for more people, we'd have to figure out what the conditions are. But that's as good a shot as any. Like when we go to Councilman Scott Davis's district, they're going to get hit as hard. Probably Colby's district and Scott Davis's district are going to get hit by the reassessment harder than anybody. everybody, and there's lots of people who have lived there for 30 years that are about to get blown up on their personal budget when the reassessment happens in that part of town. And we're not going to be able to address that gentrification issue without things other than inclusionary zoning. I assume that's your answer, Doug.
Could have said it better.
I'd just like
Well, let me say one other thing, is that I worry that if we try to tackle too many things with this piece of legislation, that we won't get it moving forward.
Well, I understand. I just wanted to be on the record saying, what got me to start working on this, I haven't seen a solution. Actually, it got worse. So I really want you guys to keep that in mind, that let's not be downtown-centric about it or UCO-centric, whatever you want to call it. I'm not accusing you of being. I'm just talking as a group. Let's look at what it does when people are gentrifying and they are coming. I mean, the state doesn't want to widen Lawrence Road. It's not funding the infrastructure. They were against the They want us to do the inclusionary zoning, right?
That's just yes.
But yet I have this problem. We all have this problem in the Southeast, and so we don't get any solutions to this problem. And I think I guess I'm venting. I apologize to you all, but I wanted to make the opportunity to bring that to your attention and remind you of what gets me to come to here.
Yeah, I was going to say, we have to do this 133 thing, but I think we got to hit these other points really hard, Doug, to your point of, MDHA and our pilot programs that we're working on for the 60% and below. What you just said about the tax freeze, the rebuilding together, that slice of the Barnes Fund, we need to do more keeping people in their homes. So we need to hit these other points really hard too as we do 133 with this inclusionary zoning that I do think will be more for the 80% AMI or the workforce housing. It's a big piece, but we have to hit these other pieces really hard and get focused on those.
It was, I'd just like to add, it's basically kind of, ringing the same bell, but that is the point about addressing gentrification has been top of mind for me as I've been going through this effort, because we've heard about it from so many different people. And in fact, the report includes an illustration of where all those demolitions are occurring. Demolitions of single family and duplex houses throughout the city, and that you see where the concentrations are. It's not exactly possible to identify where they are, but anecdotally, Councilman, you have identified one of the areas where that district is the recipient of a lot of that displacement. And I think I've tried to make it clear that an inclusionary zoning ordinance is not the tool to address that, and that a dedicated funding source, the reason why it stands as the first recommendation in this report, is that it can flexibly address those issues. There are programs that a dedicated funding source can fund that are going to be more targeted directly to that. Down payment assistance, shared equity programs are really fantastic programs to get at home ownership. I think, in fact, a shared equity program and down payment assistance are two of the best programs that exist in the country for dealing with the escaping American dream from the hands of a lot of households. That may not directly, hit on the problem that households are being displaced, but it is a tool then that is available for them, so that it's not such a hard landing.
In addition, community land trust is something that definitely is going to keep property affordable in perpetuity for renters and homeowners.
Yeah, which is in your report.
Yes.
And I was going to ask, I know, again, I guess your point about 133 can't do everything, but how does the planning department or Adrian or anybody, how would you envision that playing into this larger vision?
So, I think that's part of the next discussion with the Barnes Housing Trust Fund Commission is there a portion of funding that's dedicated for the trust fund? Is there an opportunity for an organization to maybe start a CLT or have that kind of creative piece outlined in the Barnes funding uses that could outline CLTs? The other opportunity we have, and this is just an aside, is the fact that we do have these Metro back tax properties. Although we've only done 13, there are quite a few more that we've been working with Metro Planning on to make sure that we can dispose of those properties as well. And they're kind of in the central city, to go to your point, that might help with affordable housing, and that could be used with the CLT or shared equity program, who knows? But that's how we can kind of get some home ownership.
Councilman, one of the other things, and this is, it's off target here, but the things that we talk about, mass transit affects everything that we're discussing right now, the ability for people to move around our city. But the other thing is the capital improvements budget. As it moves forward, we have to prioritize the Southeast corridor. We have to think about that when we're looking at how we prioritize how we're going to spend our capital budget, capital improvements budget, to create the infrastructure that is lacking out in that area. So,
I have an additional funny question, and David, it's for you, because I don't know if other cities have done this. One of the things, we passed a resolution recently about looking at these back tax properties, but properties that Metro own that are potentially going to offload that we would look at for potentially using for housing. Now, some of those may work and some of them may not. I don't know that an old fire hall is going to be able to be repurposed. Do you have experience in looking at other cities about when they do, in our case, put them up for e-bid, put them up for auction to the public, that they use some or all of those funds to go into the dedicated funding, like in our case, the Barnes Fund?
There are, I don't think I can point to a specific community that I've worked with that has a codified policy. At least not a codified policy that I can cite. But I would say that it is usually a council objective or a city's unwritten policy that there be obviously some kind of public benefit, a quid pro quo for here is the sale of a publicly owned site, or that is used as leverage in a public-private partnership, and so leveraged to achieve some kind of a community benefit, such as affordable housing. I would say that if there's anything codified about that, it's probably the idea that there must be some kind of a public benefit that is equal to or greater value than the actual contribution itself, which is the land.
The land, yeah. Okay.
And the great thing is that e-bid process has been halted so that we can think about our metro properties as it relates to affordable housing. And so that's why we can say those back tax properties can be used for affordable housing, and kind of talk about vacant buildings. We can have those discussions about that process. So.
Can you elaborate on vacant buildings?
Well, that's just the resolution that was just introduced by.
It's the ones where nobody lives.
Yeah.
Like, I've had several that, the landlord is paying his taxes, but I would love to let them know that if they're not going to do anything with their building, we've got great ideas.
It's Metro-owned vacant buildings.
Okay, Metro-owned.
So that's the key in that resolution.
Great.
I do want to raise a general question in a non-adversarial setting which is not tied to a zone change. There are people who have noticed the dramatic intensification of zoning, usually in keeping with newly adopted general plans by us at the commission. And they have noticed a decreasing supply of area, perhaps in Midtown, perhaps everywhere, as the boom moves on, where some of them could work, if you get my drift. And I know we don't want to rush into this, and I don't think we have. Maybe it was an unrealistic time limit that made us have to send something forward to the council. But, there really is a lot of serious concern among people who are not necessarily reactionary folks, who look at those two things and see a diminishing supply of potential places where we can do this kind of housing for the lowest of income folks and the workforce housing. And I just mentioned that because it bothers me to see it. I know a lot of investors have bought property in full reliance on the fact that everybody says we need more intense zoning, particularly in Midtown, which actually is true. I'm not backtracking on that. That actually is true. But I do see the other point that we are losing lots of possibilities. At the same time, we're losing some character as well. I guess that's not really a question. It's just my observation.
Well, and, one of the things that we talked about, I think, all along is the need to land bank and all over. And we have a fairly good idea of the areas that will continue to gentrify. And we know they're going to happen. And if we have the funding available to land bank, and I feel looking ahead that that's actually going to be one of the most controversial things, is to actually pull money out of the fund to buy land that you're not going to build on then until sometime in the future. And I suspect that that'll be very difficult to get a group to agree to do, but it is a very wise thing to do in different areas, and would have been even better had we done it 10 years ago. But it's like planting a tree, right? One of the two best times to have done that, 50 years ago and today.
And the land trust, it took a while. I mean, the green space land trust took a while.
Yes.
I talked to Jeannie Nelson the other day, and it was. I remember very vividly the conversations we had around the land trust and trying to talk to people about it in the South, and them going, "I'm not giving up farmland to them." And now it's a success.
Right.
But that competition needs to happen post-haste. I agree.
I can piggyback on Stuart's comment, and I might not have been as articulate about this when we had sessions at the end of last year as I could have. But one of the things I was most unhappy about, which I saw you fixed in this report, was there was one chart that showed rapidly appreciating parts of town, and the data was 2000 to 2014. And I thought that it was way too small an area that was not really indicative of where rapid change is happening. I saw you added a new slide that showed 2011 to 2015, and I think that one shows what we intuitively or anecdotally know from driving around the county. And that is that the place where 15 years ago young professionals who are earning a good living, but are at the beginning of life, would live in certain parts of town. Now, to me, that's the weather balloon, test balloon for where gentrification is going. And through campaigning all over the county, Madison to Donaldson to Charlotte Park to Woodbine is where the leading edge of the ripple effect is now. And if we sit on this for even another 3 or 4 years, we're going to find that from downtown up to Madison, out to Donaldson, down to Woodbine is all too expensive for people at 100% AMI to really live at. And I think the charts in this longer report, back that up, and I do think there's a great deal of time urgency to deal with that. And at the same time, we have to watch out for not overdoing it, so when the economy blows up, we haven't done something stupid. That's all we got to do.
Write that up and
If you could put that in a piece of legislation. All right, well.
wait, did you have food back there for us or something?
No, that's the wrong night. That's Thursday night, though. You'll be back here for another 12-hour day, I'm sure.
Whatever y'all come up with that y'all send back to the Planning Commission, think about it. The Planning Commission is going to have to respond to this after y'all come up with the legislation.
Yeah.
And we're going to have to think through these far-reaching what-ifs from a planning perspective.
So we need help from the folks who understand this better than we do, because not many of us are builders or financiers or developers. So we welcome constructive input from all the stakeholders, the advocates as well. I mean, the people who fund the low-income housing tax credit properties, I mean, So call us up and let's get together.
Let me tell you, before we break up here, tomorrow night, we're having the public meeting. And so if y'all can get the word out so that we can get as many people from the public here and we can hear from them on this, that's always very helpful to us. So if you'll spread the word about tomorrow night's meeting, I appreciate it.
What time is it, Zach?
5:30.
5:30. Thank you. Thanks,
Thank you,
everybody.
everybody.
Yeah.